Welcome to Mythology at Dusk. Take a slow breath. Whatever the day has held, however heavy it has been, let it settle now. Tonight, we visit ancient Greece and Rome. Tonight, 12 stories about one man. Heracles was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, born in the palace at Thebes, and already in his cradle a queen's jealousy sent 2 snakes to kill him. He strangled them both, one in each hand, before he could yet speak. He grew, and there came a day in a lonely wood when 2 women appeared to him, one offering pleasure, the other offering long, patient labor, and he chose the harder road. These are the 12 tasks that road became, beginning with the lion whose skin he would wear ever afterwards, and ending with an apple at the far edge of the world. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight and what time it is for you right now. Every comment helps this small channel reach someone else who needs quiet tonight. And if Mythology at Dusk has helped you sleep, consider subscribing so tomorrow night's story is ready when you are. Now close your eyes. Take a slow breath. Let the old stories carry you. Let us begin. The hero's line: Perseus, slayer of the Gorgon. From Perseus. Perseus, one of the most renowned of the legendary heroes of antiquity, was the son of Zeus and Danae, daughter of Heracles, king of Argos. An oracle, having foretold to Heracles that a son of Danae would be the cause of his death, he imprisoned her in a tower of brass in order to keep her secluded from the world. Zeus, however, descended through the roof of the tower in the form of a shower of gold, and the lovely Danae became his bride. For 4 years, Perseus remained in ignorance of this union, but one evening, as he chanced to pass by the brazen chamber, he heard the cry of a young child proceeding from within, which led to the discovery of his daughter's marriage with Zeus. Enraged at finding all his precautions unavailing, Perseus commanded the mother and child to be placed in a chest and thrown into the sea. But it was not the will of Zeus that they should perish. He directed Poseidon to calm the troubled waters and caused the chest to float safely to the island of Seriphus. Dictys, brother of Polydectes, king of the island, was fishing on the seashore when he saw the chest stranded on the beach, and pitying the helpless condition of its unhappy occupants, he conducted them to the palace of the king, where they were treated with the greatest kindness. Polydectes eventually became united to Danae, and 206 bestowed upon Perseus an education befitting a hero. When he saw his stepson develop into a noble and manly youth, he endeavored to instill into his mind a desire to signalize himself by the achievement of some great and heroic deed. And after mature deliberation, it was decided that the slaying of the Gorgon, Medusa, would bring him the greatest renown. For the successful accomplishment of his object, it was necessary for him to be provided with a pair of winged sandals, a magic wallet, and the helmet of Hades, which rendered the wearer invisible, all of which were in the keeping of the nymphs, the place of whose abode was known only to the Grey. Perseus started on his expedition and, guided by Hermes and Pallas Athene, arrived, after a long journey, in the far-off region, on the borders of Oceanus, where dwelt the Graeae, daughters of Phorcys and Ceto. He at once applied to them for the necessary information, and on their refusing to grant it, he deprived them of their single eye and tooth, which he only restored to them when they gave him full directions with regard to his route. He then proceeded to the abode of the nymphs, from whom he obtained the objects indispensable for his purpose. Equipped with the magic helmet and wallet, and armed with a sickle, the gift of Hermes, he attached to his feet the winged sandals and flew to the abode of the Gorgons, whom he found fast asleep. Now, as Perseus had been warned by his celestial guides that whoever looked upon these weird sisters would be transformed into stone, he stood with averted face before the sleepers and caught on his bright metal shield their triple image. Then, guided by Pallas Athene, he cut off the head of the Medusa, which he placed in his wallet. No sooner had he done so than from the headless trunk there sprang forth the winged steed Pegasus, and Chrysaor, the father of the winged giant Geryon. He now hastened to elude the pursuit of the two surviving sisters, who, aroused from their slumbers, eagerly rushed to avenge the death of their sister. 207. His invisible helmet and winged sandals here stood him in good stead, for the former concealed him from the view of the Gorgons, whilst the latter bore him swiftly over land and sea, far beyond the reach of pursuit. In passing over the burning plains of Libya, the drops of blood from the head of the Medusa oozed through the wallet, and falling on the hot sands below, produced a brood of many-coloured snakes, which spread all over the country. Perseus continued his flight until he reached the kingdom of Atlas, of whom he begged rest and shelter. But as this king possessed a valuable orchard, in which every tree bore golden fruit, he was fearful lest the slayer of the Medusa might destroy the dragon which guarded it, and then rob him of his treasures. He therefore refused to grant the hospitality which the hero demanded, whereupon Perseus, exasperated at the churlish repulse, produced from his wallet the head of the Medusa, and holding it towards the king, transformed him into a stony mountain. Beard and hair erected themselves into forests. Shoulders, hands, and limbs became huge rocks, and the head grew up into a craggy peak which reached into the clouds. Perseus then resumed his travels. His winged sandals bore him over deserts and mountains, until he arrived at Ethiopia, the kingdom of King Cepheus. Here he found the country inundated with disastrous floods, towns and villages destroyed, and everywhere signs of desolation and ruin. On a projecting cliff close to the shore, he beheld a lovely maiden chained to a rock. This was Andromeda, the king's daughter. Her mother Cassiopeia, having boasted that her beauty surpassed that of the Nereides, the angry sea nymphs appealed to Poseidon to avenge their wrongs, whereupon the sea god devastated the country with a terrible inundation, which brought with it a huge monster who devoured all that came in his way. In their distress, the unfortunate Ethiopians applied to the oracle of Jupiter Ammon in the Libyan desert, 208, and obtained the response that only by the sacrifice of the king's daughter to the monster could the country and people be saved. Cepheus, who was tenderly attached to his child, at first refused to listen to this dreadful proposal, but overcome at length by the prayers and solicitations of his unhappy subjects, the heartbroken father gave up his child for the welfare of his country. Andromeda was accordingly chained to a rock on the seashore to serve as a prey to the monster, whilst her unhappy parents bewailed her sad fate on the beach below. On being informed of the meaning of this tragic scene, Perseus proposed to Cepheus to slay the dragon, on condition that the lovely victim should become his bride. Overjoyed at the prospect of Andromeda's release, the king gladly acceded to the stipulation, and Perseus hastened to the rock to breathe words of hope and comfort to the trembling maiden. Then, assuming once more the helmet of Hades, he mounted into the air and awaited the approach of the monster. Presently the sea opened, and the shark's head of the gigantic beast of the deep raised itself above the waves. Lashing his tail furiously from side to side, he leapt forward to seize his victim, but the gallant hero, watching his opportunity, suddenly darted down and, producing the head of the Medusa from his wallet, held it before the eyes of the dragon, whose hideous body became gradually transformed into a huge black rock, which remained forever a silent witness of the miraculous deliverance of Andromeda. Perseus then led the maiden to her now happy parents, who, anxious to evince their gratitude to her deliverer, ordered immediate preparations to be made for the nuptial feast. But the young hero was not to bear away his lovely bride uncontested, for in the midst of the banquet, Phineus, the king's brother, to whom Andromeda had previously been betrothed, returned to claim his bride. Followed by a band of armed warriors, he forced his way into the hall, and a desperate encounter took place between the rivals. 209, which might have terminated fatally for Perseus, had he not suddenly bethought himself of the Medusa's head. Calling to his friends to avert their faces, he drew it from his wallet and held it before Phineus and his formidable bodyguard, whereupon they all stiffened into stone. Illustration. Perseus now took leave of the Ethiopian king and, accompanied by his beautiful bride, returned to Seriphus, where a joyful meeting took place between Danae and her son. He then sent a messenger to his grandfather, informing him that he intended returning to Argos. But Acrisius, fearing the fulfillment of the oracular prediction, fled for protection to his friend Teutemius, king of Larissa. Anxious to induce the aged monarch to return to Argos, Perseus followed him thither. But here a strange fatality occurred. Whilst taking part in some funereal games, celebrated in honor of the king's father, Perseus, by an unfortunate throw of the discus, accidentally struck his grandfather, and thereby was the innocent cause of his death. After celebrating the funereal rites of Acrisius with due solemnity, Perseus returned to Argos, but feeling loath to occupy the throne of one whose death he had caused, he exchanged kingdoms with Megapenthes, king of Tiryns, and in course of time founded the cities of Mycenae and Medea. The head of the Medusa he presented to his divine patroness, Pallas Athene, who placed it in the center of her shield. Many great heroes were descended from Perseus and Andromeda, foremost among whom was Heracles, whose mother, Alcmene, was their granddaughter. Heroic honors were paid to Perseus, not only 210 throughout Argos, but also at Athens and in the island of Seriphus. The Argonauts and the quest for the Golden Fleece. From the Argonauts, Aeson, king of Iolcus, was forced to fly from his dominions, which had been usurped by his younger brother, Peleus, and with difficulty succeeded in saving the life of his young son, Jason, who was at that time only 10 years of age. He entrusted him to the care of the centaur Chiron, by whom he was carefully trained in company with other noble youths, who, like himself, afterwards signalized themselves by their bravery and heroic exploits. For 10 years, Jason remained in the cave of the centaur, by whom he was instructed in all useful and warlike arts. But as he approached manhood, he became filled with an unconquerable desire to regain his paternal inheritance. He therefore took leave of his kind friend and preceptor, and set out for Iolcus to demand from his uncle Peleus the kingdom which he had so unjustly usurped. In the course of his journey, he came to a broad and foaming river, on the banks of which he perceived an old woman, who implored him to help her across. At first he hesitated, knowing that even alone he would find some difficulty in stemming the fierce torrent. But, 214, pitying her forlorn condition, he raised her in his arms, and succeeded, with a great effort, in reaching the opposite shore. But as soon as her feet had touched the earth, she became transformed into a beautiful woman, who, looking kindly at the bewildered youth, informed him that she was the goddess Hera, and that she would henceforth guide and protect him throughout his career. She then disappeared, and, full of hope and courage at this divine manifestation, Jason pursued his journey. He now perceived that in crossing the river, he had lost one of his sandals, but as it could not be recovered, he was obliged to proceed without it. On his arrival at Iolcus, he found his uncle in the marketplace, offering up a public sacrifice to Poseidon. When the king had concluded his offering, his eye fell upon the distinguished stranger, whose manly beauty and heroic bearing had already attracted the attention of his people. Observing that one foot was unshod, he was reminded of an oracular prediction which foretold to him the loss of his kingdom by a man wearing only one sandal. He, however, disguised his fears, conversed kindly with the youth, and drew from him his name and errand. Then, pretending to be highly pleased with his nephew, Perseus entertained him sumptuously for 5 days, during which time all was festivity and rejoicing. On the 6th, Jason appeared before his uncle, and with manly firmness demanded from him the throne and kingdom which were his by right. Perseus, dissembling his true feelings, smilingly consented to grant his request, provided that, in return, Jason would undertake an expedition for him, which his advanced age prevented him from accomplishing himself. He informed his nephew that the shade of Phrixus had appeared to him in his dreams, and entreated him to bring back from Colchis his mortal remains and the Golden Fleece, and added that if Jason succeeded in obtaining for him these sacred relics, throne, kingdom, and scepter should be his. Tune 15. From Story of the Golden Fleece, Athamas, king of Boeotia, had married Nephele, a cloud nymph, and their children were Helle and Phrixus. The restless and wandering nature of Nephele, however, soon wearied her husband, who, being a mortal, had little sympathy with his ethereal consort, so he divorced her and married the beautiful but wicked Ino, sister of Semele, who hated her stepchildren and even planned their destruction. But the watchful Nephele contrived to circumvent her cruel designs and succeeded in getting the children out of the palace. She then placed them both on the back of a winged ram with a fleece of pure gold, which had been given to her by Hermes, and on this wonderful animal brother and sister rode through the air over land and sea. But on the way Helle, becoming seized with giddiness, fell into the sea, called after her the Hellespont, and was drowned. Phrixus arrived safely at Colchis, where he was hospitably received by King Aeetes, who gave him one of his daughters in marriage. In gratitude to Zeus for the protection accorded him during his flight, Phrixus sacrificed to him the golden ram, whilst the fleece he presented to Aeetes, who nailed it up in the grove of Ares and dedicated it to the god of war. An oracle having declared that the life of Aeetes depended on the safekeeping of the fleece, he carefully guarded the entrance to the grove by placing before it an immense dragon, which never slept. Building and launch of the Argo. We will now return to Jason, who eagerly undertook the perilous expedition proposed to him by his uncle, who, well aware of the dangers attending such an enterprise, hoped by this means to rid himself forever of the unwelcome intruder. Jason accordingly began to arrange his plans without delay, and invited the young heroes whose friendship he, 216, had formed whilst under the care of Chiron, to join him in the perilous expedition. None refused the invitation, all feeling honoured at being allowed the privilege of taking part in so noble and heroic an undertaking. Jason now applied to Argos, one of the cleverest shipbuilders of his time, who, under the guidance of Pallas Athene, built for him a splendid 50-oared galley, which was called the Argo, after the builder. In the upper deck of the vessel, the goddess had embedded a board from the speaking oak of the oracle of Zeus at Dodona, which ever retained its powers of prophecy. The exterior of the ship was ornamented with magnificent carvings, and the whole vessel was so strongly built that it defied the power of the winds and waves, and was, nevertheless, so light that the heroes, when necessary, were able to carry it on their shoulders. When the vessel was completed, the Argonauts, so called after their ship, assembled, and their places were distributed by lot. Jason was appointed commander-in-chief of the expedition. Tiphys acted as steersman, Lynceus as pilot. In the bow of the vessel sat the renowned hero Heracles. In the stern, Peleus, father of Achilles, and Telamon, the father of Ajax the Great. In the inner space were Castor and Pollux, Neleus, the father of Nestor, Admetus, the husband of Alcestis, Meleager, the slayer of the Caledonian boar, Orpheus, the renowned singer, Menoctius, the father of Patroclus, Theseus, afterwards king of Athens, and his friend Perseus, the son of Ixion, Hylas, the adopted son of Heracles, Euphemus, the son of Poseidon, Oileus, father of Ajax the Lesser, Zetes and Calais, the winged sons of Boreas, Idmon the seer, the son of Apollo, Mopsus, the Thessalian prophet, etc., etc. Before their departure, Jason offered a solemn sacrifice to Poseidon and all the other sea deities. He also invoked the protection of Zeus and the Fates, and then, Mopsus having taken the auguries and found them auspicious, the heroes stepped on board. And now, a favourable breeze having sprung up, they take their allotted places. 2:17. The anchor is weighed, and the ship glides like a bird out of the harbour into the waters of the great sea. Arrival at Lemnos. The Argo, with her brave crew of 50 heroes, was soon out of sight, and the sea breeze only wafted to the shore a faint echo of the sweet strains of Orpheus. For a time all went smoothly, but the vessel was soon driven, by stress of weather, to take refuge in a harbour in the island of Lemnos. This island was inhabited by women only, who, the year before, in a fit of mad jealousy, had killed all the male population of the island, with the exception of the father of their queen, Hypsipyle. As the protection of their island now devolved upon themselves, they were always on the lookout for danger. When, therefore, they sighted the Argo from afar, they armed themselves and rushed to the shore, determined to repel any invasion of their territory. On arriving in port, the Argonauts, astonished at beholding an armed crowd of women, dispatched a herald in one of their boats, bearing the staff of peace and friendship. Hypsipyle, the queen, proposed that food and presents should be sent to the strangers in order to prevent their landing, but her old nurse, who stood beside her, suggested that this would be a good opportunity to provide themselves with noble husbands, who would act as their defenders, and thus put an end to their constant fears. Hypsipyle listened attentively to the advice of her nurse, and after some consultation, decided to invite the strangers into the city. Robed in his purple mantle, the gift of Pallas Athene, Jason, accompanied by some of his companions, stepped on shore, where he was met by a deputation consisting of the most beautiful of the Lemnian women, and, as commander of the expedition, was invited into the palace of the queen. When he appeared before Hypsipyle, she was so struck with his godlike and heroic presence that she presented him with her father's scepter and invited him to seat himself on the throne beside her. Jason, thereupon, 2:18, took up his residence in the royal castle, whilst his companions scattered themselves through the town, spending their time in feasting and pleasure. Heracles, with a few chosen comrades, alone remained on board. From day to day their departure was delayed, and the Argonauts, in their new life of dissipation, had almost forgotten the object of the expedition when Heracles suddenly appeared amongst them and at last recalled them to a sense of their duty. Giants and Doliones. The Argonauts now pursued their voyage, till contrary winds drove them towards an island inhabited by the Doliones, whose king Cyzicus received them with great kindness and hospitality. The Doliones were descendants of Poseidon, who protected them against the frequent attacks of their fierce and formidable neighbors, the earthborn giants, monsters with 6 arms. Whilst his companions were attending a banquet given by King Cyzicus, Heracles, who, as usual, had remained behind to guard the ship, observed that these giants were busy blocking up the harbor with huge rocks. He at once realized the danger and, attacking them with his arrows, succeeded in considerably thinning their numbers. Then, assisted by the heroes, who at length came to his aid, he effectually destroyed the remainder. The Argo now steered out of the harbor and set sail, but in consequence of a severe storm which arose at night, was driven back once more to the shores of the kindly Doliones. Unfortunately, however, owing to the darkness of the night, the inhabitants failed to recognize their former guests and, mistaking them for enemies, commenced to attack them. Those who had so recently parted as friends were now engaged in mortal combat, and in the battle which ensued, Jason himself pierced to the heart his friend King Cyzicus, whereupon the Doliones, being deprived of their leader, fled to their city and closed the gates. When morning dawned, and both sides perceived their error, they were filled with 219, the deepest sorrow and remorse, and for 3 days the heroes remained with the Doliones, celebrating the funereal rites of the slain, with every demonstration of mourning and solemnity. Heracles left behind. The Argonauts once more set sail, and after a stormy voyage arrived at Mysia, where they were hospitably received by the inhabitants, who spread before them plentiful banquets and sumptuously regaled them. While his friends were feasting, Heracles, who had declined to join them, went into the forest to seek a fir tree which he required for an oar, and was missed by his adopted son Hylas, who set out to seek him. When the youth arrived at a spring, in the most secluded part of the forest, the nymph of the fountain was so struck by his beauty that she drew him down beneath the waters, and he was seen no more. Polyphemus, one of the heroes, who happened to be also in the forest, heard his cry for help, and on meeting Heracles, informed him of the circumstance. They at once set out in search of the missing youth, no traces of whom were to be found, and whilst they were engaged looking for him, the Argo set sail and left them behind. The ship had proceeded some distance before the absence of Heracles was observed. Some of the heroes were in favor of returning for him, others wished to proceed on their journey, when, in the midst of the dispute, the sea god Glaucus arose from the waves and informed them that it was the will of Zeus that Heracles, having another mission to perform, should remain behind. The Argonauts continued their voyage without their companions. Heracles returned to Argos, whilst Polyphemus remained with the Mysians, where he founded a city and became its king. Contest with Amycus. Next morning, the Argo touched at the country of the Bebrycians, whose king Amycus was a famous pugilist, and permitted no strangers to leave his shores without matching their 220 strength with his. When the heroes, therefore, demanded permission to land, they were informed that they could only do so provided that one of their number should engage in a boxing match with the king. Pollux, who was the best pugilist in Greece, was selected as their champion, and a contest took place, which, after a tremendous struggle, proved fatal to Amycus, who had hitherto been victorious in all similar encounters. Phineus and the Harpies. They now proceeded towards Bithynia, where reigned the blind old prophet king Phineus, son of Agenor. Phineus had been punished by the gods with premature old age and blindness for having abused the gift of prophecy. He was also tormented by the Harpies, who swooped down upon his food, which they either devoured or so defiled as to render it unfit to be eaten. This poor old man, trembling with the weakness of age and faint with hunger, appeared before the Argonauts and implored their assistance against his fiendish tormentors, whereupon Zetes and Calais, the winged sons of Boreas, recognizing in him the husband of their sister Cleopatra, affectionately embraced him and promised to rescue him from his painful position. The heroes prepared a banquet on the seashore, to which they invited Phineus, but no sooner had he taken his place than the Harpies appeared and devoured all the viands. Zetes and Calais now rose up into the air, drove the Harpies away, and were pursuing them with drawn swords, when Iris, the swift-footed messenger of the gods, appeared and desired them to desist from their work of vengeance, promising that Phineus should be no longer molested. Freed at length from his tormentors, the old man sat down and enjoyed a plentiful repast with his kind friends the Argonauts, who now informed him of the object of their voyage. In gratitude for his deliverance, Phineus gave them much useful information concerning their journey, and not only warned them of the manifold 221 dangers awaiting them, but also instructed them how they might be overcome. Passage of the Symplegades. After a fortnight's sojourn in Bithynia, the Argonauts once more set sail, but had not proceeded far on their course, when they heard a fearful and tremendous crash. This was caused by the meeting of two great rocky islands, called the Symplegades, which floated about in the sea and constantly met and separated. Before leaving Bithynia, the blind old seer, Phineus, had informed them that they would be compelled to pass between these terrible rocks, and he instructed them how to do so with safety. As they now approached the scene of danger, they remembered his advice and acted upon it. Typhus, the steersman, stood at the helm, whilst Euphemus held in his hand a dove ready to be let loose. For Phineus had told them that if the dove ventured to fly through, they might safely follow. Euphemus now dispatched the bird, which passed swiftly through the islands, yet not without losing some of the feathers of her tail, so speedily did they reunite. Seizing the moment when the rocks once more separated, the Argonauts worked at their oars with all their might, and achieved the perilous passage in safety. After the miraculous passage of the Argo, the Symplegades became permanently united and attached to the bottom of the sea, the Stymphalides. The Argo pursued her course along the southern coast of the Pontus and arrived at the island of Aretius, which was inhabited by birds, who, as they flew through the air, discharged from their wings feathers sharp as arrows. As the ship was gliding along, Oileus was wounded by one of these birds, whereupon the Argonauts held a council, and by the advice of Amphidamas, an experienced hero, all put on their helmets and held up their glittering shields, uttering, at the same time, such fearful cries that 222, the birds flew away in terror, and the Argonauts were enabled to land with safety on the island. Here they found 4 shipwrecked youths, who proved to be the sons of Phrixus, and were greeted by Jason as his cousins. On ascertaining the object of the expedition, they volunteered to accompany the Argo, and to show the heroes the way to Colchis. They also informed them that the Golden Fleece was guarded by a fearful dragon, that King Aeetes was extremely cruel, and, as the son of Apollo, was possessed of superhuman strength. Arrival at Colchis. Taking with them the 4 newcomers, they journeyed on, and soon came in sight of the snow-capped peaks of the Caucasus, when, towards evening, the loud flapping of wings was heard overhead. It was the giant eagle of Prometheus on his way to torture the noble and long-suffering Titan, whose fearful groans soon afterwards fell upon their ears. That night they reached their journey's end and anchored in the smooth waters of the river Phases. On the left bank of this river they beheld Ceuta, the capital of Colchis, and on their right a wide field and the sacred grove of Ares, where the Golden Fleece, suspended from a magnificent oak tree, was glittering in the sun. Jason now filled a golden cup with wine and offered a libation to Mother Earth, the gods of the country, and the shades of those of the heroes who had died on the voyage. Next morning, a council was held in which it was decided that before resorting to forcible measures, kind and conciliatory overtures should first be made to King Aeetes in order to induce him to resign the Golden Fleece. It was arranged that Jason, with a few chosen companions, should proceed to the royal castle, leaving the remainder of the crew to guard the Argo. Accompanied, therefore, by Telamon and Augeas and the 4 sons of Phrixus, he set out for the palace. When they arrived in sight of the castle, they were struck by the vastness and massiveness of the building, at the entrance to which sparkling fountains played in 223, the midst of luxuriant and park-like gardens. Here the king's daughters, Chalciope and Medea, who were walking in the grounds of the palace, met them. The former, to her great joy, recognized in the youths who accompanied the hero her own long-lost sons, whom she had mourned as dead, whilst the young and lovely Medea was struck with the noble and manly form of Jason. The news of the return of the sons of Phrixus soon spread through the palace, and brought Aeetes himself to the scene, whereupon the strangers were presented to him, and were invited to a banquet which the king ordered to be prepared in their honor. All the most beautiful ladies of the court were present at this entertainment, but in the eyes of Jason, none could compare with the king's daughter, the young and lovely Medea. When the banquet was ended, Jason related to the king his various adventures, and also the object of his expedition, with the circumstances which had led to his undertaking it. Aeetes listened, in silent indignation, to this recital, and then burst out into a torrent of invectives against the Argonauts and his grandchildren, declaring that the fleece was his rightful property, and that on no consideration would he consent to relinquish it. Jason, however, with mild and persuasive words, contrived so far to conciliate him that he was induced to promise that if the heroes could succeed in demonstrating their divine origin by the performance of some task requiring superhuman power, the fleece should be theirs. The task proposed by Aeetes to Jason was that he should yoke the 2 brazen-footed, fire-breathing oxen of the king, which had been made for him by Hephaestus, to his ponderous iron plough. Having done this, he must till with them the stony field of Ares, and then sow in the furrows the poisonous teeth of a dragon, from which armed men would arise. These he must destroy to a man, or he himself would perish at their hands. When Jason heard what was expected of him, his heart for a moment sank within him, but he determined, nevertheless, not to flinch from his task, but to trust to the 224th assistance of the gods and to his own courage and energy. Jason plows the field of Ares, accompanied by his two friends, Telamon and Algaeus, and also by Argus, the son of Chalciope. Jason returned to the vessel for the purpose of holding a consultation as to the best means of accomplishing these perilous feats. Argus explained to Jason all the difficulties of the superhuman task which lay before him, and pronounced it as his opinion that the only means by which success was possible was to enlist the assistance of the Princess Medea, who was a priestess of Hecate and a great enchantress. His suggestion meeting with approval, he returned to the palace, and by the aid of his mother, an interview was arranged between Jason and Medea, which took place at an early hour next morning in the temple of Hecate. A confession of mutual attachment took place, and Medea, trembling for her lover's safety, presented him with a magic salve, which possessed the property of rendering any person anointed with it invulnerable for the space of 1 day against fire and steel, and invincible against any adversary, however powerful. With this salve, she instructed him to anoint his spear and shield on the day of his great undertaking. She further added that when, after having ploughed the field and sown the teeth, armed men should arise from the furrows, he must on no account lose heart, but remember to throw among them a huge rock, over the possession of which they would fight among themselves, and their attention being thus diverted, he would find it an easy task to destroy them. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Jason thanked her, in the most earnest manner, for her wise counsel and timely aid. At the same time, he offered her his hand, and promised her he would not return to Greece without taking her with him as his wife. Next morning, Aeetes, in all the pomp of state, surrounded by his family and the members of his court, 9-25 repaired to a spot whence a full view of the approaching spectacle could be obtained. Soon, Jason appeared in the field of Ares, looking as noble and majestic as the god of war himself. In a distant part of the field, the brazen yokes and the massive plough met his view, but as yet, the dread animals themselves were nowhere to be seen. He was about to go in quest of them, when they suddenly rushed out from a subterranean cave, breathing flames of fire and enveloped in a thick smoke. The friends of Jason trembled, but the undaunted hero, relying on the magic powers with which he was imbued by Medea, seized the oxen, one after the other, by the horns, and forced them to the yoke. Near the plough was a helmet full of dragon's teeth, which he sowed as he ploughed the field, whilst with sharp pricks from his lance, he compelled the monstrous creatures to draw the plough over the stony ground, which was thus speedily tilled. While Jason was engaged sowing the dragon's teeth in the deep furrows of the field, he kept a cautious lookout lest the germinating giant brood might grow too quickly for him, and as soon as the 4 acres of land had been tilled, he unyoked the oxen, and succeeded in frightening them so effectually with his weapons that they rushed back in terror to their subterranean stables. Meanwhile, armed men had sprung up out of the furrows, and the whole field now bristled with lances. But Jason, remembering the instructions of Medea, seized an immense rock and hurled it into the midst of these earthborn warriors, who immediately began to attack each other. Jason then rushed furiously upon them, and after a terrible struggle, not one of the giants remained alive. Furious at seeing his murderous schemes thus defeated, Aeetes not only perfidiously refused to give Jason the fleece which he had so bravely earned, but, in his anger, determined to destroy all the Argonauts and to burn their vessel. Jason secures the Golden Fleece. Becoming aware of the treacherous designs of her father, Medea at 226 once took measures to baffle them. In the darkness of night, she went on board the Argo and warned the heroes of their approaching danger. She then advised Jason to accompany her without loss of time to the sacred grove in order to possess himself of the long-coveted treasure. They set out together, and Medea, followed by Jason, led the way and advanced boldly into the grove. The tall oak tree was soon discovered, from the topmost boughs of which hung the beautiful Golden Fleece. At the foot of this tree, keeping his ever-wakeful watch, lay the dreadful, sleepless dragon, who at sight of them bounded forward, opening his huge jaws. Medea now called into play her magic powers, and quietly approaching the monster, threw over him a few drops of a potion, which soon took effect, and sent him into a deep sleep, whereupon Jason, seizing the opportunity, climbed the tree and secured the fleece. Their perilous task being now accomplished, Jason and Medea quitted the grove and hastened on board the Argo, which immediately put to sea. Murder of Absyrtus. Meanwhile, Aeetes, having discovered the loss of his daughter and the Golden Fleece, dispatched a large fleet under the command of his son Absyrtus in pursuit of the fugitives. After some days' sail, they arrived at an island at the mouth of the river Ister, where they found the Argo at anchor and surrounded her with their numerous ships. They then dispatched a herald on board of her, demanding the surrender of Medea and the fleece. Medea now consulted Jason and, with his consent, carried out the following stratagem. She sent a message to her brother Absyrtus to the effect that she had been carried off against her will, and promised that if he would meet her in the darkness of night in the temple of Artemis, she would assist him in regaining possession of the Golden Fleece. Relying on the good faith of his sister, Absyrtus fell into the snare and duly appeared at the appointed trysting place. And whilst Medea kept her 227th brother engaged in conversation, Jason rushed forward and slew him. Then, according to a preconcerted signal, he held aloft a lighted torch, whereupon the Argonauts attacked the Colchians, put them to flight, and entirely defeated them. The Argonauts now returned to their ship, when the prophetic board from the Dodonean oak thus addressed them. The cruel murder of Absyrtus was witnessed by the Erinyes, and you will not escape the wrath of Zeus until the goddess Circe has purified you from your crime. Let Castor and Pollux pray to the gods that you may be enabled to find the abode of the sorceress. In obedience to the voice, the twin brothers invoked divine assistance, and the heroes set out in search of the Isle of Circe. They arrive at the island of Circe. The good ship Argo sped on her way, and, after passing safely through the foaming waters of the river Eridanus, at length arrived in the harbour of the island of Circe, where she cast anchor. Commanding his companions to remain on board, Jason landed with Medea and conducted her to the palace of the sorceress. The goddess of charms and magic arts received them kindly and invited them to be seated, but instead of doing so, they assumed a supplicating attitude and humbly besought her protection. They then informed her of the dreadful crime which they had committed and implored her to purify them from it. This Circe promised to do. She forthwith commanded her attendant naiads to kindle the fire on the altar and to prepare everything necessary for the performance of the mystic rites, after which a dog was sacrificed and the sacred cakes were burned. Having thus duly purified the criminals, she severely reprimanded them for the horrible murder of which they had been guilty, whereupon Medea, with veiled head and weeping bitterly, was reconducted by Jason to the Argo. further adventures of the Argonauts. Having left the island of Circe, they were wafted by gentle 228 zephyrs towards the abode of the Sirens, whose enticing strains soon fell upon their ears. The Argonauts, powerfully affected by the melody, were making ready to land when Orpheus perceived the danger and, to the accompaniment of his magic lyre, commenced one of his enchanting songs, which so completely absorbed his listeners that they passed the island in safety, but not before Butes, one of their number, lured by the seductive music of the Sirens, had sprung from the vessel into the waves below. Aphrodite, however, in pity for his youth, landed him gently on the island of Libybaon before the Sirens could reach him, and there he remained for many years. And now the Argonauts approached new dangers, for on one side of them seethed and foamed the whirlpool of Charybdis, whilst on the other towered the mighty rock whence the monster Scylla swooped down upon unfortunate mariners. But here the goddess Hera came to their assistance, and sent to them the sea nymph Thetis, who guided them safely through these dangerous straits. The Argo next arrived at the island of the Phaeaces, where they were hospitably entertained by King Alcinous and his queen Arete. But the banquet prepared for them by their kind host was unexpectedly interrupted by the appearance of a large army of Colchians, sent by Aeetes to demand the restoration of his daughter. Medea threw herself at the feet of the queen and implored her to save her from the anger of her father, and Arete, in her kindness of heart, promised her protection. Next morning, in an assembly of the people at which the Colchians were invited to be present, the latter were informed that as Medea was the lawful wife of Jason, they could not consent to deliver her up. Whereupon the Colchians, seeing that the resolution of the king was not to be shaken, and fearing to face the anger of Aeetes should they return to Colchis without her, sought permission of Alcinous to settle in his kingdom, which request was accorded them. 229. After these events, the Argonauts once more set sail and steered for Iolcus. But, in the course of a terrible and fearful night, a mighty storm arose, and in the morning they found themselves stranded on the treacherous quicksands of Syrtes, on the shores of Libya. Here all was a waste and barren desert, untenanted by any living creature, save the venomous snakes which had sprung from the blood of the Medusa when borne by Perseus over these arid plains. They had already passed several days in this abode of desolation, beneath the rays of the scorching sun, and had abandoned themselves to the deepest despair when the Libyan queen, who was a prophetess of divine origin, appeared to Jason and informed him that a seahorse would be sent by the gods to act as his guide. Scarcely had she departed when a gigantic hippocamp was seen in the distance, making its way towards the Argo. Jason now related to his companions the particulars of his interview with the Libyan prophetess, and after some deliberation, it was decided to carry the Argo on their shoulders and to follow wherever the seahorse should lead them. They then commenced a long and weary journey through the desert, and at last, after 12 days of severe toil and terrible suffering, the welcome sight of the sea greeted their view. In gratitude for having been saved from their manifold dangers, they offered up sacrifices to the gods and launched their ship once more into the deep waters of the ocean. Arrival at Crete. With heartfelt joy and gladness, they proceeded on their homeward voyage, and after some days arrived at the island of Crete, where they purposed to furnish themselves with fresh provisions and water. Their landing, however, was opposed by a terrible giant who guarded the island against all intruders. This giant, whose name was Talus, was the last of the brazen race, and being formed of brass, was invulnerable, except in his right ankle, where there was a sinew of flesh and a vein of blood. As he saw the Argo 230 nearing the coast, he hurled huge rocks at her, which would inevitably have sunk the vessel had not the crew beat a hasty retreat. Although sadly in want of food and water, the Argonauts had decided to proceed on their journey rather than face so powerful an opponent, when Medea came forward and assured them that if they would trust to her, she would destroy the giant. Enveloped in the folds of a rich purple mantle, she stepped on deck, and after invoking the aid of the fates, uttered a magic incantation, which had the effect of throwing Talus into a deep sleep. He stretched himself at full length upon the ground, and in doing so grazed his vulnerable ankle against the point of a sharp rock, whereupon a mighty stream of blood gushed forth from the wound. Awakened by the pain, he tried to rise, but in vain, and with a mighty groan of anguish, the giant fell dead, and his enormous body rolled heavily over into the deep. The heroes, being now able to land, provisioned their vessel, after which they resumed their homeward voyage. Arrival at Iolcus. After a terrible night of storm and darkness, they passed the island of Aegina, and at length reached in safety the port of Iolcus, where the recital of their numerous adventures and hairbreadth escapes was listened to with wondering admiration by their fellow countrymen. The Argo was consecrated to Poseidon and was carefully preserved for many generations till no vestige of it remained, when it was placed in the heavens as a brilliant constellation. On his arrival at Iolcus, Jason conducted his beautiful bride to the palace of his uncle Peleus, taking with him the Golden Fleece, for the sake of which this perilous expedition had been undertaken. But the old king, who had never expected that Jason would return alive, basely refused to fulfill his part of the compact and declined to abdicate the throne. 231. Indignant at the wrongs of her husband, Medea avenged them in a most shocking manner. She made friends with the daughters of the king and feigned great interest in all their concerns. Having gained their confidence, she informed them that among her numerous magic arts, she possessed the power of restoring to the aged all the vigor and strength of youth, and in order to give them a convincing proof of the truth of her assertion, she cut up an old ram, which she boiled in a cauldron, whereupon, after uttering various mystic incantations, there came forth from the vessel a beautiful young lamb. She then assured them that in a similar manner they could restore to their old father his former youthful frame and vigor. The fond and credulous daughters of Peleus lent an all too willing ear to the wicked sorceress, and thus the old king perished at the hands of his innocent children. Death of Jason. Medea and Jason now fled to Corinth, where at length they found, for a time, peace and tranquility, their happiness being completed by the birth of 3 children. As time passed on, however, and Medea began to lose the beauty which had won the love of her husband, he grew weary of her and became attracted by the youthful charms of Glauce, the beautiful daughter of Creon, king of Corinth. Jason had obtained her father's consent to their union, and the wedding day was already fixed, before he disclosed to Medea the treachery which he meditated against her. He used all his persuasive powers in order to induce her to consent to his union with Glauce, assuring her that his affection had in no way diminished, but that for the sake of the advantages which would thereby accrue to their children, he had decided on forming this alliance with the royal house. Though justly enraged at his deceitful conduct, Medea dissembled her wrath, and, feigning to be satisfied with this explanation, sent, as a wedding gift to her rival, a magnificent robe of cloth of gold. This robe was imbued with a deadly 232 poison, which penetrated to the flesh and bone of the wearer, and burned them as though with a consuming fire. Pleased with the beauty and costliness of the garment, the unsuspecting Glaus lost no time in donning it. But no sooner had she done so than the fell poison began to take effect. In vain she tried to tear the robe away. It defied all efforts to be removed, and after horrible and protracted sufferings, she expired. Maddened at the loss of her husband's love, Medea next put to death her 3 sons, and when Jason, thirsting for revenge, left the chamber of his dead bride and flew to his own house in search of Medea, the ghastly spectacle of his murdered children met his view. He rushed frantically to seek the murderess, but nowhere could she be found. At length, hearing a sound above his head, he looked up and beheld Medea gliding through the air in a golden chariot drawn by dragons. In a fit of despair, Jason threw himself on his own sword and perished on the threshold of his desolate and deserted home. Heracles, birth, the 12 labours, and the long wandering. From Pelops. Pelops, the son of the cruel Tantalus, was a pious and virtuous prince. After his father was banished into Tartarus, a war ensued between Pelops and the king of Troy, in which the former was vanquished and forced to fly from his dominions in Phrygia. He emigrated into Greece, where, at the court of Oenomaus, king of Elis, he beheld Hippodamia, the king's daughter, whose beauty won his heart. But an oracle having foretold to Oenomaus that he would die on the day of his daughter's marriage, he threw every obstacle in the way of her suitors and declared that he would only give her to him who succeeded in vanquishing him in a chariot race, but that all unsuccessful competitors should suffer death at his hands. The conditions of the contest were as follows. The race was to be run from a given point at Pisa to the altar of Poseidon at Corinth. The suitor was allowed to start 233 on his course, whilst Oenomaus performed his sacrifice to Zeus, and only on its completion did the king mount his chariot, guided by the skillful Myrtilus, and drawn by his 2 famous horses, Phila and Harpina, who surpassed in swiftness the winds themselves. In this manner, many a gallant young prince had perished, for although a considerable start was given to all competitors, still Oenomaus, with his swift team, always overtook them before they reached the goal, and killed them with his spear. But the love of Pelops for Hippodamia overcame all fears, and, undeterred by the terrible fate of his predecessors, he announced himself to Oenomaus as a suitor for the hand of his daughter. On the eve of the race, Pelops repaired to the seashore and earnestly implored Poseidon to assist him in his perilous undertaking. The sea god heard his prayer and sent him out of the deep a chariot drawn by 2 winged horses. When Pelops appeared on the course, the king at once recognized the horses of Poseidon, but, nothing daunted, he relied on his own supernatural team, and the contest was allowed to proceed. Whilst the king was offering his sacrifice to Zeus, Pelops set out on the race and had nearly reached the goal when, turning round, he beheld Oenomaus, spear in hand, who, with his magic steeds, had nearly overtaken him. But in this emergency, Poseidon came to the aid of the son of Tantalus. He caused the wheels of the royal chariot to fly off, whereupon the king was thrown out violently and killed on the spot, just as Pelops arrived at the altar of Poseidon. As the hero was about to return to Pisa to claim his bride, he beheld, in the distance, flames issuing from the royal castle, which at that instant had been struck by lightning. With his winged horses, he flew to rescue his lovely bride, and succeeded in extricating her uninjured from the burning building. They soon afterwards became united, and Pelops reigned in Pisa for many years in great splendor. 234. Heracles, Hercules. Heracles, the most renowned hero of antiquity, was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, and the great-grandson of Perseus. At the time of his birth, Alcmene was living at Thebes with her husband Amphitryon, and thus the infant Heracles was born in the palace of his stepfather. Aware of the animosity with which Hera persecuted all those who rivaled her in the affections of Zeus, Alcmene, fearful lest this hatred should be visited on her innocent child, entrusted him, soon after his birth, to the care of a faithful servant, with instructions to expose him in a certain field, and there leave him, feeling assured that the divine offspring of Zeus would not long remain without the protection of the gods. Soon after the child had been thus abandoned, Hera and Pallas Athene happened to pass by the field, and were attracted by its cries. Athene pityingly took up the infant in her arms, and prevailed upon the Queen of Heaven to put it to her breast. But no sooner had she done so, than the child, causing her pain, she angrily threw him to the ground, and left the spot. Athene, moved with compassion, carried him to Alcmene, and entreated her kind offices on behalf of the poor little foundling. Alcmene at once recognized her child, and joyfully accepted the charge. Soon afterwards, Hera, to her extreme annoyance, discovered whom she had nursed, and became filled with jealous rage. She now sent 2 venomous snakes into the chamber of Alcmene, which crept, unperceived by the nurses, to the cradle of the sleeping child. He awoke with a cry, and grasping a snake in each hand, strangled them both. Alcmene and her attendants, whom the cry of the child had awakened, rushed to the cradle, where, to their astonishment and terror, they beheld the 2 reptiles dead in the hands of the infant Heracles. Amphitryon was also attracted to the chamber by the 235 commotion, and when he beheld this astounding proof of supernatural strength, he declared that the child must have been sent to him as a special gift from Zeus. He accordingly consulted the famous seer Tiresias, who now informed him of the divine origin of his stepson, and prognosticated for him a great and distinguished future. When Amphitryon heard the noble destiny which awaited the child entrusted to his care, he resolved to educate him in a manner worthy of his future career. At a suitable age, he himself taught him how to guide a chariot, Eurytus, how to handle the bow, Autolycus, dexterity in wrestling and boxing, and Castor, the art of armed warfare, whilst Linus, the son of Apollo, instructed him in music and letters. Heracles was an apt pupil, but undue harshness was intolerable to his high spirit, and old Linus, who was not the gentlest of teachers, one day corrected him with blows, whereupon the boy angrily took up his lyre and, with one stroke of his powerful arm, killed his tutor on the spot. Apprehensive lest the ungovernable temper of the youth might again involve him in similar acts of violence, Amphitryon sent him into the country, where he placed him under the charge of one of his most trusted herdsmen. Here, as he grew up to manhood, his extraordinary stature and strength became the wonder and admiration of all beholders. His aim, whether with spear, lance, or bow, was unerring, and at the age of 18 he was considered to be the strongest as well as the most beautiful youth in all Greece. The choice of Heracles. Heracles felt that the time had now arrived when it became necessary to decide for himself how to make use of the extraordinary powers with which he had been endowed by the gods. And in order to meditate in solitude on this all-important subject, he repaired to a lonely and secluded spot in the heart of the forest. Here, two females of great beauty appeared to him. 236. One was vice, the other virtue. The former was full of artificial wiles and fascinating arts, her face painted and her dress gaudy and attractive, whilst the latter was of noble bearing and modest mien, her robes of spotless purity. Vice stepped forward and thus addressed him: "If you will walk in my paths and make me your friend, your life shall be one round of pleasure and enjoyment. You shall taste of every delight which can be procured on earth, the choicest viands, the most delicious wines, the most luxuriant of couches shall be ever at your disposal, and all this without any exertion on your part, either physical or mental." Virtue now spoke in her turn. "If you will follow me and be my friend, I promise you the reward of a good conscience and the love and respect of your fellowmen. I cannot undertake to smooth your path with roses or to give you a life of idleness and pleasure. For you must know that the gods grant no good and desirable thing that is not earned by labor, and as you sow, so must you reap." Heracles listened patiently and attentively to both speakers, and then, after mature deliberation, decided to follow in the paths of virtue, and henceforth to honor the gods, and to devote his life to the service of his country. Full of these noble resolves, he sought once more his rural home, where he was informed that on Mount Cithaeron, at the foot of which the herds of Amphitryon were grazing, a ferocious lion had fixed his lair, and was committing such frightful ravages among the flocks and herds that he had become the scourge and terror of the whole neighborhood. Heracles at once armed himself and ascended the mountain, where he soon caught sight of the lion, and rushing at him with his sword, succeeded in killing him. The hide of the animal he wore ever afterwards over his shoulders, and the head served him as a helmet. As he was returning from this, his first exploit, he met 237, the heralds of Erginus, king of the Minyans, who were proceeding to Thebes to demand their annual tribute of 100 oxen. Indignant at this humiliation of his native city, Heracles mutilated the heralds and sent them back, with ropes round their necks, to their royal master. Erginus was so incensed at the ill treatment of his messengers that he collected an army and appeared before the gates of Thebes, demanding the surrender of Heracles. Creon, who was at this time king of Thebes, fearing the consequences of a refusal, was about to yield when the hero, with the assistance of Amphitryon and a band of brave youths, advanced against the Minyans. Heracles took possession of a narrow defile through which the enemy were compelled to pass, and as they entered the pass, the Thebans fell upon them, killed their king Erginus, and completely routed them. In this engagement, Amphitryon, the kind friend and foster father of Heracles, lost his life. The hero now advanced upon Orchomenus, the capital of the Minyans, where he burned the royal castle and sacked the town. After this signal, victory all Greece rang with the fame of the young hero, and Creon, in gratitude for his great services, bestowed upon him his daughter Megara in marriage. The Olympian gods testified their appreciation of his valor by sending him presents. Hermes gave him a sword, Phoebus Apollo a bundle of arrows, Hephaestus a golden quiver, and Athena a coat of leather, Heracles and Eurystheus. And now it will be necessary to retrace our steps. Just before the birth of Heracles, Zeus, in an assembly of the gods, exultingly declared that the child who should be born on that day to the house of Perseus should rule over all his race. When Hera heard her lord's boastful announcement, she knew well that it was for the child of the hated Alcmaeon that this brilliant destiny was designed, and in order to rob the son of her rival of his rights, she called to her aid the goddess Eileithyia, who retarded the birth of 32 Heracles, and caused his cousin Eurystheus, another grandson of Perseus, to precede him into the world. And thus, as the word of the mighty Zeus was irrevocable, Heracles became the subject and servant of his cousin Eurystheus. When, after his splendid victory over Erginus, the fame of Heracles spread throughout Greece, Eurystheus, who had become king of Mycenae, jealous of the reputation of the young hero, asserted his rights and commanded him to undertake for him various difficult tasks. But the proud spirit of the hero rebelled against this humiliation, and he was about to refuse compliance when Zeus appeared to him and desired him not to rebel against the fates. Heracles now repaired to Delphi in order to consult the oracle, and received the answer that after performing 10 tasks for his cousin Eurystheus, his servitude would be at an end. Soon afterwards, Heracles fell into a state of the deepest melancholy, and through the influence of his inveterate enemy, the goddess Hera, this despondency developed into raving madness, in which condition he killed his own children. When he at length regained his reason, he was so horrified and grieved at what he had done that he shut himself up in his chamber and avoided all intercourse with men. But in his loneliness and seclusion, the conviction that work would be the best means of procuring oblivion of the past decided him to enter, without delay, upon the tasks appointed him by Eurystheus. 1. The Nemean lion. His first task was to bring to Eurystheus the skin of the much-dreaded Nemean lion, which ravaged the territory between Cleone and Nemea, and whose hide was invulnerable against any mortal weapon. Heracles proceeded to the forest of Nemea, where, having discovered the lion's lair, he attempted to pierce him with his arrows, but finding these of no avail, he felled him to the ground with his club, and before the animal had time to recover from the terrible blow, 239, Heracles seized him by the neck and, with a mighty effort, succeeded in strangling him. He then made himself a coat of mail of the skin and a new helmet of the head of the animal. Thus attired, he so alarmed Eurystheus by appearing suddenly before him that the king concealed himself in his palace and henceforth forbade Heracles to enter his presence, but commanded him to receive his behests for the future through his messenger, Perseus. 2. The Hydra. His second task was to slay the Hydra, a monster serpent, the offspring of Typhon and Echidna, bristling with 9 heads, one of which was immortal. This monster infested the neighborhood of Lerna, where she committed great depredations among the herds. Illustration: Heracles, accompanied by his nephew Iolaus, set out in a chariot for the marsh of Lerna, in the slimy waters of which he found her. He commenced the attack by assailing her with his fierce arrows, in order to force her to leave her lair, from which she at length emerged, and sought refuge in a wood on a neighboring hill. Heracles now rushed forward, and endeavored to crush her heads by means of well-directed blows from his tremendous club. But no sooner was one head destroyed than it was immediately replaced by 2 others. He next seized the monster in his powerful grasp. But at this juncture, a giant crab came to the assistance of the Hydra and commenced biting the feet of her assailant. Heracles destroyed this new adversary with his club, and now called upon his nephew to come to his aid. At his command, Iolaus set fire to the neighboring trees, 240, and, with a burning branch, seared the necks of the monster as Heracles cut them off, thus effectually preventing the growth of more. Heracles next struck off the immortal head, which he buried by the roadside, and placed over it a heavy stone. Into the poisonous blood of the monster he then dipped his arrows, which ever afterwards rendered wounds inflicted by them incurable. 3. The horned hind. The third labor of Heracles was to bring the horned hind Cerunitis alive to Mycenae. This animal, which was sacred to Artemis, had golden antlers and hoofs of brass. Not wishing to wound the hind, Heracles patiently pursued her through many countries for a whole year, and overtook her at last on the banks of the river Ladon. But even there he was compelled, in order to secure her, to wound her with one of his arrows, after which he lifted her on his shoulders and carried her through Arcadia. On his way, he met Artemis with her brother Phoebus Apollo, when the goddess angrily reproved him for wounding her favorite hind. But Heracles succeeded in appeasing her displeasure, whereupon she permitted him to take the animal alive to Mycenae. Illustration. 4. The Erymantian boar. The fourth task imposed upon Heracles by Eurystheus was to bring alive to Mycenae the Erymantian boar, which had laid waste the region of Erymantia and was the scourge of the surrounding neighborhood. On his way thither, he craved food and shelter of a centaur named Pholus, who received him with generous hospitality, setting before him a good and plentiful repast. When Heracles expressed his surprise that at such a well-furnished board, 241 wine should be wanting, his host explained that the wine cellar was the common property of all the centaurs, and that it was against the rules for a cask to be broached, except all were present to partake of it. By dint of persuasion, however, Heracles prevailed on his kind host to make an exception in his favor, but the powerful, luscious odor of the good old wine soon spread over the mountains and brought large numbers of centaurs to the spot, all armed with huge rocks and fir trees. Heracles drove them back with firebrands, and then, following up his victory, pursued them with his arrows as far as Malea, where they took refuge in the cave of the kind old centaur Chiron. Unfortunately, however, as Heracles was shooting at them with his poisoned darts, one of these pierced the knee of Chiron. When Heracles discovered that it was the friend of his early days that he had wounded, he was overcome with sorrow and regret. He at once extracted the arrow and anointed the wound with a salve, the virtue of which had been taught him by Chiron himself. But all his efforts were unavailing. The wound, imbued with the deadly poison of the hydra, was incurable, and so great was the agony of Chiron that, at the intercession of Heracles, death was sent him by the gods, for otherwise, being immortal, he would have been doomed to endless suffering. Pholus, who had so kindly entertained Heracles, also perished by means of one of these arrows, which he had extracted from the body of a dead centaur. While he was quietly examining it, astonished that so small and insignificant an object should be productive of such serious results, the arrow fell upon his foot and fatally wounded him. Full of grief at this untoward event, Heracles buried him with due honors and then set out to chase the boar. With loud shouts and terrible cries, he first drove him out of the thickets into the deep snowdrifts which covered the summit of the mountain, and then, having at length wearied him with his incessant pursuit, he captured the exhausted animal, bound him with a rope, and brought him alive to Mycenae. 242. 5. Cleansing the stables of Augeas. After slaying the Erymantian boar, Eurystheus commanded Heracles to cleanse in one day the stables of Augeas. Augeas was a king of Elis who was very rich in herds. 3,000 of his cattle he kept near the royal palace in an enclosure where the refuse had accumulated for many years. When Heracles presented himself before the king and offered to cleanse his stables in one day, provided he should receive in return a 10th part of the herds. Augeas, thinking the feat impossible, accepted his offer in the presence of his son Phileus. Near the palace were the two rivers Peneus and Alpheus, the streams of which Heracles conducted into the stables by means of a trench which he dug for this purpose, and as the waters rushed through the shed, they swept away with them the whole mass of accumulated filth. But when Augeas heard that this was one of the labours imposed by Eurystheus, he refused the promised guerdon. Heracles brought the matter before a court, and called Phileus as a witness to the justice of his claim, whereupon Augeas, without waiting for the delivery of the verdict, angrily banished Heracles and his son from his dominions. 6. The Stymphalides. The sixth task was to chase away the Stymphalides, which were immense birds of prey who, as we have seen in the legend of the Argonauts, shot from their wings feathers sharp as arrows. The home of these birds was on the shore of the lake Stymphalis, in Arcadia, after which they were called, where they caused great destruction among men and cattle. On approaching the lake, Heracles observed great numbers of them, and, while hesitating how to commence the attack, he suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder. Looking round, he beheld the majestic form of Pallas Athene, who held in her hand a gigantic pair of brazen clappers made by Hephaestus, with which she, 243, presented him, whereupon he ascended to the summit of a neighbouring hill and commenced to rattle them violently. The shrill noise of these instruments was so intolerable to the birds that they rose into the air in terror, upon which he aimed at them with his arrows, destroying them in great numbers, while such as escaped his darts flew away, never to return. 7. The Cretan Bull. The seventh labour of Heracles was to capture the Cretan bull. Minos, king of Crete, having vowed to sacrifice to Poseidon any animal which should first appear out of the sea, the god caused a magnificent bull to emerge from the waves in order to test the sincerity of the Cretan king, who, in making this vow, had alleged that he possessed no animal, among his own herds, worthy the acceptance of the mighty sea god. Charmed with the splendid animal sent by Poseidon, and eager to possess it, Minos placed it among his herds, and substituted as a sacrifice one of his own bulls. Hereupon Poseidon, in order to punish the cupidity of Minos, caused the animal to become mad, and commit such great havoc in the island as to endanger the safety of the inhabitants. When Heracles, therefore, arrived in Crete for the purpose of capturing the bull, Minos, far from opposing his design, gladly gave him permission to do so. The hero not only succeeded in securing the animal, but tamed him so effectually that he rode on his back right across the sea as far as the Peloponnesus. He now delivered him up to Eurystheus, who at once set him at liberty, after which he became as ferocious and wild as before, roamed all over Greece into Arcadia, and was eventually killed by Theseus on the plains of Marathon. 8. The mares of Diomedes. The eighth labour of Heracles was to bring to Eurystheus the mares of Diomedes, a son of Ares, and king of the Bistonians, a warlike Thracian tribe. This king possessed a breed of wild horses of tremendous size and strength, whose food consisted of human flesh, and all strangers who had the 244 misfortune to enter the country were made prisoners and flung before the horses, who devoured them. When Heracles arrived, he first captured the cruel Diomedes himself, and then threw him before his own mares, who, after devouring their master, became perfectly tame and tractable. They were then led by Heracles to the seashore, when the Bistonians, enraged at the loss of their king, rushed after the hero and attacked him. He now gave the animals in charge of his friend Abderus, and made such a furious onslaught on his assailants that they turned and fled. But on his return from this encounter, he found, to his great grief, that the mares had torn his friend in pieces and devoured him. After celebrating due funereal rites to the unfortunate Abderus, Heracles built a city in his honor, which he named after him. He then returned to Tiryns, where he delivered up the mares to Eurystheus, who set them loose on Mount Olympus, where they became the prey of wild beasts. It was after the performance of this task that Heracles joined the Argonauts in their expedition to gain possession of the Golden Fleece, and was left behind at Chios, as already narrated. During his wanderings, he undertook his 9th labor, which was to bring to Eurystheus the girdle of Hippolyte, queen of the Amazons. 9. The girdle of Hippolyte. The Amazons, who dwelt on the shores of the Black Sea, near the river Thermodon, were a nation of warlike women, renowned for their strength, courage, and great skill in horsemanship. Their queen, Hippolyte, had received from her father, Ares, a beautiful girdle, which she always wore as a sign of her royal power and authority, and it was this girdle which Heracles was required to place in the hands of Eurystheus, who designed it as a gift for his daughter Admete. Foreseeing that this would be a task of no ordinary difficulty, the hero called to his aid a select band of brave companions, with whom he embarked for the Amazonian 245 town Themyscira. Here they were met by Queen Hippolyte, who was so impressed by the extraordinary stature and noble bearing of Heracles that, on learning his errand, she at once consented to present him with the coveted girdle. But Hera, his implacable enemy, assuming the form of an Amazon, spread the report in the town that a stranger was about to carry off their queen. The Amazons at once flew to arms and mounted their horses, whereupon a battle ensued, in which many of their bravest warriors were killed or wounded. Among the latter was their most skillful leader, Melanippe, whom Heracles afterwards restored to Hippolyte, receiving the girdle in exchange. On his voyage home, the hero stopped at Troy, where a new adventure awaited him. During the time that Apollo and Poseidon were condemned by Zeus to a temporary servitude on Earth, they built for King Laomedon the famous walls of Troy, afterwards so renowned in history. But when their work was completed, the king treacherously refused to give them the reward due to them. The incensed deities now combined to punish the offender. Apollo sent a pestilence which decimated the people, and Poseidon a flood, which bore with it a marine monster, who swallowed in his huge jaws all that came within his reach. In his distress, Laomedon consulted an oracle, and was informed that only by the sacrifice of his own daughter, Hesione, could the anger of the gods be appeased. Yielding at length to the urgent appeals of his people, he consented to make the sacrifice, and on the arrival of Heracles, the maiden was already chained to a rock in readiness to be devoured by the monster. When Laomedon beheld the renowned hero, whose marvelous feats of strength and courage had become the wonder and admiration of all mankind, he earnestly implored him to save his daughter from her impending fate and to rid the country of the monster, holding out to him as a reward the horses which Zeus had presented to 246, his grandfather Tros, in compensation for robbing him of his son Ganymede. Heracles unhesitatingly accepted the offer, and when the monster appeared, opening his terrible jaws to receive his prey, the hero, sword in hand, attacked and slew him. But the perfidious monarch once more broke faith, and Heracles, vowing future vengeance, departed for Mycenae, where he presented the girdle to Eurystheus. 10. The oxen of Geryones. The 10th labor of Heracles was the capture of the magnificent oxen belonging to the giant Geryon or Geryones, who dwelt on the island of Erythea in the Bay of Gadria, Cadiz. This giant, who was the son of Chrysaor, had 3 bodies with 3 heads, 6 hands, and 6 feet. He possessed a herd of splendid cattle, which were famous for their size, beauty, and rich red color. They were guarded by another giant named Eurytion and a 2-headed dog called Orthrus, the offspring of Typhon and Echidna. In choosing for him a task so replete with danger, Eurystheus was in hopes that he might rid himself forever of his hated cousin. But the indomitable courage of the hero rose with the prospect of this difficult and dangerous undertaking. After a long and wearisome journey, he at last arrived at the western coast of Africa, where, as a monument of his perilous expedition, he erected the famous Pillars of Hercules, one of which he placed on each side of the Straits of Gibraltar. Here he found the intense heat so insufferable that he angrily raised his bow towards heaven and threatened to shoot the sun god. But Helios, far from being incensed at his audacity, was so struck with admiration at his daring that he lent to him the golden boat with which he accomplished his nocturnal transit from west to east, and thus Heracles crossed over safely to the island of Erythea. No sooner had he landed than Eurytion, accompanied by his savage dog Orthrus, fiercely attacked him, but Heracles, with a superhuman effort, slew the dog and 247, then his master. Hereupon he collected the herd and was proceeding to the seashore when Geryones himself met him, and a desperate encounter took place, in which the giant perished. Heracles then drove the cattle into the sea, and seizing one of the oxen by the horns, swam with them over to the opposite coast of Iberia, Spain. Then driving his magnificent prize before him through Gaul, Italy, Illyria, and Thrace, he at length arrived, after many perilous adventures and hair-breadth escapes, at Mycenae, where he delivered them up to Eurystheus, who sacrificed them to Hera. Heracles had now executed his 10 tasks, which had been accomplished in the space of 8 years. But Eurystheus refused to include the slaying of the hydra and the cleansing of the stables of Algaeus among the number, alleging as a reason that the one had been performed by the assistance of Iolaus, and that the other had been executed for hire. He therefore insisted on Heracles substituting 2 more labors in their place. 11. The apples of the Hesperides. The 11th task imposed by Eurystheus was to bring him the golden apples of the Hesperides, which grew on a tree presented by Gaia to Hera on the occasion of her marriage with Zeus. This sacred tree was guarded by 4 maidens, daughters of Night, called the Hesperides, who were assisted in their task by a terrible 100-headed dragon. This dragon never slept, and out of its 100 throats came a constant hissing sound, which effectually warned off all intruders. But what rendered the undertaking still more difficult was the complete ignorance of the hero as to the locality of the garden, and he was forced, in consequence, to make many fruitless journeys and to undergo many trials before he could find it. He first travelled through Thessaly and arrived at the river Echedorus, where he met the giant Cycnus, the son of Ares and Pyrene, who challenged him to single combat. In this encounter, Heracles completely vanquished 248, his opponent, who was killed in the contest. But now a mightier adversary appeared on the scene, for the war god himself came to avenge his son. A terrible struggle ensued, which had lasted some time, when Zeus interfered between the brothers and put an end to the strife by hurling a thunderbolt between them. Heracles proceeded on his journey and reached the banks of the river Eridanus, where dwelt the nymphs, daughters of Zeus and Themis. On seeking advice from them as to his route, they directed him to the old sea god Nereus, who alone knew the way to the garden of the Hesperides. Heracles found him asleep, and seizing the opportunity, held him so firmly in his powerful grasp that he could not possibly escape, so that notwithstanding his various metamorphoses, he was at last compelled to give the information required. The hero then crossed over to Libya, where he engaged in a wrestling match with King Antios, son of Poseidon and Gaia, which terminated fatally for his antagonist. From thence he proceeded to Egypt, where reigned Busiris, another son of Poseidon, who, acting on the advice given by an oracle during a time of great scarcity, sacrificed all strangers to Zeus. When Heracles arrived, he was seized and dragged to the altar, but the powerful demigod burst asunder his bonds, and then slew Busiris and his son. Resuming his journey, he now wandered on through Arabia until he arrived at Mount Caucasus, where Prometheus groaned in unceasing agony. It was at this time that Heracles, as already related, shot the eagle which had so long tortured the noble and devoted friend of mankind. More full of gratitude for his deliverance, Prometheus instructed him how to find his way to that remote region in the far west where Atlas supported the heavens on his shoulders, near which lay the garden of the Hesperides. He also warned Heracles not to attempt to secure the precious fruit himself, but to assume for a time the duties of Atlas and to dispatch him for the apples. 249. On arriving at his destination, Heracles followed the advice of Prometheus. Atlas, who willingly entered into the arrangement, contrived to put the dragon to sleep, and then, having cunningly outwitted the Hesperides, carried off 3 of the golden apples, which he now brought to Heracles. But when the latter was prepared to relinquish his burden, Atlas, having once tasted the delights of freedom, declined to resume his post, and announced his intention of being himself the bearer of the apples to Eurystheus, leaving Heracles to fill his place. To this proposal the hero feigned assent, merely begging that Atlas would be kind enough to support the heavens for a few moments whilst he contrived a pad for his head. Atlas good-naturedly threw down the apples and once more resumed his load, upon which Heracles bade him adieu and departed. When Heracles conveyed the golden apples to Eurystheus, the latter presented them to the hero, whereupon Heracles placed the sacred fruit on the altar of Pallas Athene, who restored them to the garden of the Hesperides. 12. Cerberus. The 12th and last labor which Eurystheus imposed on Heracles was to bring up Cerberus from the lower world, believing that all his heroic powers would be unavailing in the realm of shades, and that in this, his last and most perilous undertaking, the hero must at length succumb and perish. Illustration. Cerberus was a monster dog with 3 heads, out of whose awful jaws dripped poison. The hair of his head and back was formed of venomous snakes, and his body terminated in the tail of a dragon. After being initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, and 250, obtaining from the priests certain information necessary for the accomplishment of his task, Heracles set out for Taenarum in Lacolia, where there was an opening which led to the underworld. Conducted by Hermes, he commenced his descent into the awful gulf, where myriads of shades soon began to appear, all of whom fled in terror at his approach, Meleager and Medusa alone excepted. About to strike the latter with his sword, Hermes interfered and stayed his hand, reminding him that she was but a shadow, and that consequently no weapon could avail against her. Arrived before the gates of Hades, he found Theseus and Pirithous, who had been fixed to an enchanted rock by Aides for their presumption in endeavoring to carry off Persephone. When they saw Heracles, they implored him to set them free. The hero succeeded in delivering Theseus, But when he endeavored to liberate Perseus, the earth shook so violently beneath him that he was compelled to relinquish his task. Proceeding further, Heracles recognized Ascalaphus, who, as we have seen in the history of Demeter, had revealed the fact that Persephone had swallowed the seeds of a pomegranate offered to her by her husband, which bound her to Hades forever. Ascalaphus was groaning beneath a huge rock which Demeter in her anger had hurled upon him, and which Heracles now removed, releasing the sufferer. Before the gates of his palace stood Hades, the mighty ruler of the lower world, and barred his entrance. But Heracles, aiming at him with one of his unerring darts, shot him in the shoulder, so that for the first time the god experienced the agony of mortal suffering. Heracles then demanded of him permission to take Cerberus to the upper world, and to this Hades consented on condition that he should secure him unarmed. Protected by his breastplate and lion's skin, Heracles went in search of the monster, whom he found at the mouth of the river Acheron. Undismayed by the hideous barking which proceeded from his 3 heads, he seized the 251 throat with one hand and the legs with the other, and although the dragon which served him as a tail bit him severely, he did not relinquish his grasp. In this manner he conducted him to the upper world, through an opening near Troezen in Argolia. When Eurystheus beheld Cerberus, he stood aghast, and despairing of ever getting rid of his hated rival, he returned the hellhound to the hero, who restored him to Hades, and with this last task, the subjection of Heracles to Eurystheus terminated. Murder of Iphitus. Free at last, Heracles now returned to Thebes, and it being impossible for him to live happily with Megara in consequence of his having murdered her children, he, with her own consent, gave her in marriage to his nephew Iolaus. Heracles himself sought the hand of Iole, daughter of Eurytus, king of Oechalia, who had instructed him when a boy in the use of the bow. Hearing that this king had promised to give his daughter to him who could surpass himself and his 3 sons in shooting with the bow, Heracles lost no time in presenting himself as a competitor. He soon proved that he was no unworthy pupil of Eurytus, for he signally defeated all his opponents. But although the king treated him with marked respect and honor, he refused, nevertheless, to give him the hand of his daughter, fearing for her a similar fate to that which had befallen Megara. Iphitus, the eldest son of Eurytus, alone espoused the cause of Heracles, and essayed to induce his father to give his consent to the marriage, but all to no purpose, and at length, stung to the quick at his rejection, the hero angrily took his departure. Soon afterwards, the oxen of the king were stolen by the notorious thief Autolycus, and Heracles was suspected by Eurytus of having committed the theft. But Iphitus loyally defended his absent friend and proposed to seek out Heracles, and with his assistance to go in search of the missing cattle. 252. The hero warmly welcomed his staunch young friend and entered cordially into his plan. They at once set out on their expedition, but their search proved altogether unsuccessful. When they approached the city of Tiryns, they mounted a tower in hopes of discovering the missing herd in the surrounding country. But as they stood on the topmost summit of the building, Heracles became suddenly seized with one of his former attacks of madness, and mistaking his friend Iphitus for an enemy, hurled him down into the plain below, and he was killed on the spot. Heracles now set forth on a weary pilgrimage, begging in vain that someone would purify him from the murder of Iphitus. It was during these wanderings that he arrived at the palace of his friend Admetus, whose beautiful and heroic wife, Alcestes, he restored to her husband after a terrible struggle with death, as already related. Soon after this event, Heracles was struck with a fearful disease and betook himself to the temple of Delphi, hoping to obtain from the oracle the means of relief. The priestess, however, refused him a response on the ground of his having murdered Iphitus, whereupon the angry hero seized upon the tripod, which he carried off, declaring that he would construct an oracle for himself. Apollo, who witnessed the sacrilege, came down to defend his sanctuary, and a violent struggle ensued. Zeus once more interfered, and, flashing his lightnings between his two favorite sons, ended the combat. The Pythia now vouchsafed an answer to the prayer of the hero, and commanded him, in expiation of his crime, to allow himself to be sold by Hermes for 3 years as a slave, the purchase money to be given to Eurytus in compensation for the loss of his son. Heracles becomes the slave of Omphale. Heracles bowed in submission to the divine will, and was conducted by Hermes to Omphale, queen of Lydia. The 3 talents which she paid for him were given 253 to Eurytus, who, however, declined to accept the money, which was handed over to the children of Iphitus. Heracles now regained his former vigor. He rid the territory of Omphale of the robbers, which infested it, and performed for her various other services, requiring strength and courage. It was about this time that he took part in the Caledonian boar hunt, details of which have already been given. When Omphale learned that her slave was none other than the renowned Heracles himself, she at once gave him his liberty, and offered him her hand and kingdom. In her palace, Heracles abandoned himself to all the enervating luxuries of an oriental life, and so completely was the great hero enthralled by the fascination which his mistress exercised over him, that whilst she playfully donned his lion's skin and helmet, he, attired in female garments, sat at her feet spinning wool, and beguiling the time by the relation of his past adventures. But when at length, his term of bondage having expired, he became master of his own actions, the manly and energetic spirit of the hero reasserted itself, and tearing himself away from the palace of the Maeonian queen, he determined to carry out the revenge he had so long meditated against the treacherous Laomedon and the faithless Augeas. Heracles executes vengeance on Laomedon and Augeas. Gathering round him some of his old brave companions in arms, Heracles collected a fleet of vessels and set sail for Troy, where he landed, took the city by storm, and killed Laomedon, who thus met at length the retribution he had so richly deserved. To Telamon, one of his bravest followers, he gave Hesione, the daughter of the king, in marriage. When Heracles gave her permission to release one of the prisoners of war, she chose her own brother Perseus, whereupon she was informed that as he was already a prisoner of war, she would be compelled to ransom him. Mall 254. On hearing this, Hesione took off her golden diadem, which she joyfully handed to the hero. Owing to this circumstance, Perseus henceforth bore the name of Priamus, or Priam, which signifies the ransomed one. Heracles now marched against Augeas to execute his vengeance on him also for his perfidious conduct. He stormed the city of Elis and put to death Augeas and his sons, sparing only his brave advocate and staunch defender Phyleus, on whom he bestowed the vacant throne of his father. Heracles and Deianira. Heracles now proceeded to Caledon, where he wooed the beautiful Deianira, daughter of Eueneus, king of Aetolia, but he encountered a formidable rival in Achelous, the river god, and it was agreed that their claim should be decided by single combat. Trusting to his power of assuming various forms at will, Achelous felt confident of success, but this availed him nothing, for having at last transformed himself into a bull, his mighty adversary broke off one of his horns, and compelled him to acknowledge himself defeated. After passing 3 happy years with Deianira, an unfortunate accident occurred, which for a time marred their felicity. Heracles was one day present at a banquet given by Oeneus, when, by a sudden swing of his hand, he had the misfortune to strike on the head a youth of noble birth, who, according to the custom of the ancients, was serving the guests at table, and so violent was the blow that it caused his death. The father of the unfortunate youth, who had witnessed the occurrence, saw that it was the result of accident, and therefore absolved the hero from blame. But Heracles resolved to act according to the law of the land, banished himself from the country, and bidding farewell to his father-in-law, set out for Trachine to visit his friend King Ceyx, taking with him his wife Deianira and his young son Hyllus. In the course of their journey they arrived at the river Evenus, over which the centaur Nessus was in the habit, 255, of carrying travellers for hire. Heracles, with his little son in his arms, forded the stream unaided, entrusting his wife to the care of the centaur, who, charmed with the beauty of his fair burden, attempted to carry her off. But her cries were heard by her husband, who without hesitation shot Nessus through the heart with one of his poisoned arrows. Now the dying centaur was thirsting for revenge. He called Deianira to his side and directed her to secure some of the blood which flowed from his wound, assuring her that if, when in danger of losing her husband's affection, she used it in the manner indicated by him, it would act as a charm and prevent her from being supplanted by a rival. Heracles and Deianira now pursued their journey, and after several adventures at length arrived at their destination. Death of Heracles. The last expedition undertaken by the great hero was against Eurytus, king of Oechalia, to revenge himself upon this king and his sons for having refused to bestow upon him the hand of Iole, after having fairly won the maiden. Having collected a large army, Heracles set out for Euboea in order to besiege Oechalia, its capital. Success crowned his arms. He stormed the citadel, slew the king and his 3 sons, reduced the town to ashes, and carried away captive the young and beautiful Iole. Returning from his victorious expedition, Heracles halted at Senuis in order to offer a sacrifice to Zeus, and sent to Deianira to Trachine for a sacrificial robe. Deianira, having been informed that the fair Iole was in the train of Heracles, was fearful lest her youthful charms might supplant her in the affection of her husband, and calling to mind the advice of the dying centaur, she determined to test the efficacy of the love charm which he had given to her. Taking out the phial which she had carefully preserved, she imbued the robe with a portion of the liquid which it contained, and then sent it to Heracles. The victorious hero clothed himself with the garment, 256, and was about to perform the sacrifice, when the hot flames rising from the altar heated the poison with which it was imbued, and soon every fibre of his body was penetrated by the deadly venom. The unfortunate hero, suffering the most fearful tortures, endeavoured to tear off the robe, but it adhered so closely to the skin that all his efforts to remove it only increased his agonies. In this pitiable condition, he was conveyed to Trachine, where Deianira, on beholding the terrible suffering of which she was the innocent cause, was overcome with grief and remorse, and hanged herself in despair. The dying hero called his son Hyllus to his side, and desired him to make Iole his wife, and then ordering his followers to erect a funeral pyre, he mounted it and implored the bystanders to set fire to it, and thus in mercy to terminate his insufferable torments. But no one had the courage to obey him, until at last his friend and companion Philoctetes, yielding to his piteous appeal, lighted the pile, and received in return the bow and arrows of the hero. Soon, flames on flames ascended, and amidst vivid flashes of lightning, accompanied by awful peals of thunder, Pallas Athene descended in a cloud and bore her favorite hero in a chariot to Olympus. Heracles became admitted among the immortals, and Hera, in token of her reconciliation, bestowed upon him the hand of her beautiful daughter Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth. Hercules, a second telling from the Latin tradition. From chapter 99, Hercules, Hebe and Ganymede. Hercules was the son of Jupiter and Alcmena. As Juno was always hostile to the offspring of her husband by mortal mothers, she declared war against Hercules from his birth. She sent 2 serpents to destroy him as he lay in his cradle, but the precocious infant strangled them with his own hands. He was, however, by the arts of Juno rendered subject to Eurystheus and compelled to perform all his commands. Eurystheus enjoined upon him a succession of desperate adventures, which are called the 12 labors of Hercules. The first was the fight with the Nemean lion. The valley of Nemea was infested by a terrible lion. Eurystheus ordered Hercules to bring him the skin of this monster. After using in vain his club and arrows against the lion, Hercules strangled the animal with his hands. He returned carrying the dead lion on his shoulders, but Eurystheus was so frightened at the sight of it and at this proof of the prodigious strength of the hero that he ordered him to deliver the account of his exploits in future outside the town. His next labor was the slaughter of the hydra. This monster ravaged the country of Argos and dwelt in a swamp near the well of Amymone. This well had been discovered by Amymone when the country was suffering from drought, and the story was that Neptune, who loved her, had permitted her to touch the rock with his trident, and a spring of 3 outlets burst forth. Here the hydra took up his position, and Hercules was sent to destroy him. The hydra had 9 heads, of which the middle one was immortal. Hercules struck off its heads with his club, but in the place of the head knocked off, 2 new ones grew forth each time. At length, with the assistance of his faithful servant Iolaus, he burned away the heads of the hydra and buried the 9th or immortal one under a huge rock. Another labor was the cleaning of the Augean stables. Augeas, king of Elis, had a herd of 3,000 oxen, whose stalls had not been cleansed for 30 years. Hercules brought the rivers Alpheus and Peneus through them, and cleansed them thoroughly in 1 day. His next labor was of a more delicate kind. Admeta, the daughter of Eurystheus, longed to obtain the girdle of the queen of the Amazons, and Eurystheus ordered Hercules to go and get it. The Amazons were a nation of women. They were very warlike and held several flourishing cities. It was their custom to bring up only the female children. The boys were either sent away to the neighboring nations or put to death. Hercules was accompanied by a number of volunteers, and after various adventures at last reached the country of the Amazons. Hippolyta, the queen, received him kindly and consented to yield him her girdle, but Juno, taking the form of an Amazon, went and persuaded the rest that the strangers were carrying off their queen. They instantly armed and came in great numbers down to the ship. Hercules, thinking that Hippolyta had acted treacherously, slew her, and taking her girdle made sail homewards. Another task enjoined him was to bring to Eurystheus the oxen of Geryon, a monster with 3 bodies, who dwelt in the island Erythea, the Red, so called because it lay at the west, under the rays of the setting sun. This description is thought to apply to Spain, of which Geryon was king. After traversing various countries, Hercules reached at length the frontiers of Libya and Europe, where he raised the two mountains of Calpe and Abila as monuments of his progress, or, according to another account, rent one mountain into two and left half on each side, forming the Straits of Gibraltar, the two mountains being called the Pillars of Hercules. The oxen were guarded by the giant Eurytion and his two-headed dog, but Hercules killed the giant and his dog and brought away the oxen in safety to Eurystheus. The most difficult labor of all was getting the golden apples of the Hesperides, for Hercules did not know where to find them. These were the apples which Juno had received at her wedding from the goddess of the earth, and which she had entrusted to the keeping of the daughters of Hesperus, assisted by a watchful dragon. After various adventures, Hercules arrived at Mount Atlas in Africa. Atlas was one of the Titans who had warred against the gods, and after they were subdued, Atlas was condemned to bear on his shoulders the weight of the heavens. He was the father of the Hesperides, and Hercules thought might, if anyone could, find the apples and bring them to him. But how to send Atlas away from his post, or bear up the heavens while he was gone? Hercules took the burden on his own shoulders and sent Atlas to seek the apples. He returned with them, and though somewhat reluctantly, took his burden upon his shoulders again and let Hercules return with the apples to Eurystheus. Milton, in his Comus, makes the Hesperides the daughters of Hesperus and nieces of Atlas. Amidst the gardens fair of Hesperus and his daughters three, that sing about the golden tree. The poets, led by the analogy of the lovely appearance of the western sky at sunset, viewed the west as a region of brightness and glory. Hence they placed in it the Isles of the Blessed, the ruddy isle Erythea, on which the bright oxen of Geryon were pastured, and the Isle of the Hesperides. The apples are supposed by some to be the oranges of Spain, of which the Greeks had heard some obscure accounts. A celebrated exploit of Hercules was his victory over Antaeus. Antaeus, the son of Terra, the earth, was a mighty giant and wrestler, whose strength was invincible so long as he remained in contact with his mother Earth. He compelled all strangers who came to his country to wrestle with him, on condition that if conquered, as they all were, they should be put to death. Hercules encountered him, and finding that it was of no avail to throw him, for he always rose with renewed strength from every fall, he lifted him up from the earth and strangled him in the air. Cacus was a huge giant who inhabited a cave on Mount Aventine and plundered the surrounding country. When Hercules was driving home the oxen of Geryon, Cacus stole part of the cattle while the hero slept. That their footprints might not serve to show where they had been driven, he dragged them backward by their tails to his cave, so their tracks all seemed to show that they had gone in the opposite direction. Hercules was deceived by this stratagem and would have failed to find his oxen if it had not happened that in driving the remainder of the herd past the cave where the stolen ones were concealed, those within began to low and were thus discovered. Cacus was slain by Hercules. The last exploit we shall record was bringing Cerberus from the lower world. Hercules descended into Hades, accompanied by Mercury and Minerva. He obtained permission from Pluto to carry Cerberus to the upper air, provided he could do it without the use of weapons. And in spite of the monster's struggling, he seized him, held him fast, and carried him to Eurystheus, and afterwards brought him back again. When he was in Hades, he obtained the liberty of Theseus, his admirer and imitator, who had been detained a prisoner there for an unsuccessful attempt to carry off Proserpine. Hercules, in a fit of madness, killed his friend Iphitus, and was condemned for this offence to become the slave of Queen Omphale for 3 years. While in this service, the hero's nature seemed changed. He lived effeminately, wearing at times the dress of a woman and spinning wool with the handmaidens of Omphale, while the queen wore his lion's skin. When this service was ended, he married Deianira and lived in peace with her 3 years. On one occasion, as he was traveling with his wife, they came to a river, across which the centaur Nessus carried travelers for a stated fee. Hercules himself forded the river, but gave Deianira to Nessus to be carried across. Nessus attempted to run away with her, but Hercules heard her cries and shot an arrow into the heart of Nessus. The dying centaur told Deianira to take a portion of his blood and keep it, as it might be used as a charm to preserve the love of her husband. Deianira did so, and before long fancied she had occasion to use it. Hercules, in one of his conquests, had taken prisoner a fair maiden named Iole, of whom he seemed more fond than Deianira approved. When Hercules was about to offer sacrifices to the gods in honor of his victory, he sent to his wife for a white robe to use on the occasion. Deianira, thinking it a good opportunity to try her love spell, steeped the garment in the blood of Nessus. We are to suppose she took care to wash out all traces of it, but the magic power remained, and as soon as the garment became warm on the body of Hercules, the poison penetrated into all his limbs and caused him the most intense agony. In his frenzy, he seized Lycus, who had brought him the fatal robe, and hurled him into the sea. He wrenched off the garment, but it stuck to his flesh, and with it he tore away whole pieces of his body. In this state, he embarked on board a ship and was conveyed home. Deianira, on seeing what she had unwittingly done, hung herself. Hercules, prepared to die, ascended Mount Oeta, where he built a funeral pile of trees, gave his bow and arrows to Philoctetes, and laid himself down on the pile, his head resting on his club, and his lion's skin spread over him. With a countenance as serene as if he were taking his place at a festal board, he commanded Philoctetes to apply the torch. The flames spread apace and soon invested the whole mass. Milton thus alludes to the frenzy of Hercules. As when Alcides, from Oechalia crowned with conquest, felt the envenomed robe, and tore, through pain, up by the roots, Thessalian pines and lichens from the top of Oeta through into the Euboic Sea. Footnote: Alcides, a name of Hercules. The gods themselves felt troubled at seeing the champion of the earth so brought to his end. But Jupiter, with cheerful countenance, thus addressed them: "I am pleased to see your concern, my princes, and am gratified to perceive that I am the ruler of a loyal people, and that my son enjoys your favor. For although your interest in him arises from his noble deeds, yet it is not the less gratifying to me. But now I say to you, fear not. He who conquered all else is not to be conquered by those flames which you see blazing on Mount Oeta. Only his mother's share in him can perish. What he derived from me is immortal. I shall take him, dead to earth, to the heavenly shores, and I require of you all to receive him kindly. If any of you feel grieved at his attaining this honor, yet no one can deny that he has deserved it." The gods all gave their assent. Juno only heard the closing words with some displeasure that she should be so particularly pointed at, yet not enough to make her regret the determination of her husband. So when the flames had consumed the mother's share of Hercules, the diviner part, instead of being injured thereby, seemed to start forth with new vigor, to assume a more lofty port and a more awful dignity. Jupiter enveloped him in a cloud, and took him up in a 4-horse chariot to dwell among the stars. As he took his place in heaven, Atlas felt the added weight. Juno, now reconciled to him, gave him her daughter Hebe in marriage. The poet Schiller, in one of his pieces called The Ideal and Life, illustrates the contrast between the practical and the imaginative in some beautiful stanzas, of which the last 2 may be thus translated: "Deep degraded to a coward's slave, endless contests bore Alcides brave, through the thorny path of suffering led, slew the hydra, crushed the lion's might, threw himself to bring his friend to light, living in the skiff that bears the dead. All the torments, every toil of earth Juno's hatred on him could impose, well he bore them, from his fated birth to life's grandly mournful close, till the god, the earthly part forsaken, from the man in flames asunder taken, drank the heavenly ether's purer breath. Joyous in the new unwanted lightness, soared he upwards to celestial brightness, earth's dark heavy burden lost in death. High Olympus gives harmonious greeting to the hall where reigns his sire adored. Youth's bright goddess, with a blush at meeting, gives the nectar to her lord. S.G.B. Hebe and Ganymede. Hebe, the daughter of Juno and goddess of youth, was cupbearer to the gods. The usual story is that she resigned her office on becoming the wife of Hercules. But there is another statement which our countryman Crawford, the sculptor, has adopted in his group of Hebe and Ganymede, now in the Athenaeum Gallery. According to this, Hebe was dismissed from her office in consequence of a fall which she met with one day when in attendance on the gods. Her successor was Ganymede, a Trojan boy, whom Jupiter, in the disguise of an eagle, seized and carried off from the midst of his playfellows on Mount Ida, bore up to heaven, and installed in the vacant place. Tennyson, in his Palace of Art, describes among the decorations on the walls a picture representing this legend. There, too, flushed Ganymede, his rosy thigh half buried in the eagle's down, soul as a flying star shot through the sky above the pillared town. And in Shelley's Prometheus, Jupiter calls to his cupbearer thus: "Pour forth heaven's wine, Idaean Ganymede, and let it fill the daedal cups like fire." The beautiful legend of the choice of Hercules may be found in the Tatler, No. 97. The return of the Heraclidae. From the Heraclidae. After the apotheosis of Heracles, his children were so cruelly persecuted by Eurystheus that they fled for protection to King Ceyx at Trachin, accompanied by the aged Iolaus, the nephew and lifelong friend of their father, who constituted himself their guide and protector. But on Eurystheus demanding the surrender of the fugitives, the Heraclidae, knowing that the small force at the disposal of King Ceyx would be altogether inadequate to protect them against the powerful king of Argos, abandoned his territory and sought refuge at Athens, where they were hospitably received by King Demophoon, the son of the great hero Theseus. He warmly espoused their cause and determined to protect them at all costs against Eurystheus, who had dispatched a numerous force in pursuit of them. When the Athenians had made all necessary preparations to repel the invaders, an oracle announced that the 281 sacrifice of a maiden of noble birth was necessary to ensure to them victory, whereupon Macaria, the beautiful daughter of Heracles and Deianira, magnanimously offered herself as a sacrifice and, surrounded by the noblest matrons and maidens of Athens, voluntarily devoted herself to death. While these events were transpiring in Athens, Hyllus, the eldest son of Heracles and Deianira, had advanced with a large army to the assistance of his brothers, and having sent a messenger to the king announcing his arrival, Demophoon, with his army, joined his forces. In the thick of the battle which ensued, Iolaus, following a sudden impulse, borrowed the chariot of Hyllus and earnestly entreated Zeus and Hebe to restore to him, for this one day only, the vigor and strength of his youth. His prayer was heard. A thick cloud descended from heaven and enveloped the chariot, and when it disappeared, Iolaus, in the full plenitude of manly vigor, stood revealed before the astonished gaze of the combatants. He then led on his valiant band of warriors, and soon the enemy was in headlong flight, and Eurystheus, who was taken prisoner, was put to death by the command of King Demophoon. After gratefully acknowledging the timely aid of the Athenians, Hyllus, accompanied by the faithful Iolaus and his brothers, took leave of King Demophoon and proceeded to invade the Peloponnesus, which they regarded as their lawful patrimony. For, according to the will of Zeus, it should have been the rightful possession of their father, the great hero Heracles, had not Hera maliciously defeated his plans by causing his cousin Eurystheus to precede him into the world. For the space of 12 months, the Heraclidae contrived to maintain themselves in the Peloponnesus. But at the expiration of that time, a pestilence broke out, which spread over the entire peninsula and compelled the Heraclidae to evacuate the country and return to Attica, where for a time they settled. After the lapse of 3 years, Hyllus resolved on 282, making another effort to obtain his paternal inheritance. Before setting out on the expedition, however, he consulted the oracle of Delphi, and the response was that he must wait for the third fruit before the enterprise would prove successful. Interpreting this ambiguous reply to signify the third summer, Hyllus controlled his impatience for 3 years, when, having collected a powerful army, he once more entered the Peloponnesus. At the Isthmus of Corinth, he was opposed by Atreus, the son of Pelops, who at the death of Eurystheus had inherited the kingdom. In order to save bloodshed, Hyllus offered to decide his claims by single combat, the conditions being that if he were victorious, he and his brothers should obtain undisputed possession of their rights. But if defeated, the Heraclidae were to desist for 50 years from attempting to press their claim. The challenge was accepted by Ecamon, king of Tegea, and Hyllus lost his life in the encounter, whereupon the sons of Heracles, in virtue of their agreement, abandoned the Peloponnesus and retired to Marathon. Hyllus was succeeded by his son Cleodaeus, who, at the expiration of the appointed time, collected a large army and invaded the Peloponnesus. But he was not more successful than his father had been, and perished there with all his forces. 20 years later, his son Aristomachus consulted an oracle, which promised him victory if he went by way of the defile. The Heraclidae once more set out, but were again defeated, and Aristomachus shared the fate of his father and grandfather, and fell on the field of battle. When, at the expiration of 30 years, the sons of Aristomachus, Temenus, Cresphontes, and Aristodemus again consulted the oracle, the answer was still the same. But this time the following explanation accompanied the response. The third fruit signified the third generation, to which they themselves belonged, and not the third fruit of the earth, and by the defile was indicated, not the Isthmus of Corinth, but the straits on the right of the isthmus. 283. Temenus lost no time in collecting an army and building ships of war. But just as all was ready and the fleet about to sail, Aristodemus, the youngest of the brothers, was struck by lightning. To add to their misfortunes, Hippolytes, a descendant of Heracles, who had joined in the expedition, killed a soothsayer whom he mistook for a spy, and the gods, in their displeasure, sent violent tempests, by means of which the entire fleet was destroyed, whilst famine and pestilence decimated the ranks of the army. The oracle, on being again consulted, advised that Hippolytes, being the offender, should be banished from the country for 10 years, and that the command of the troops should be delegated to a man having 3 eyes. A search was at once instituted by the Heraclidae for a man answering to this description, who was found at length in the person of Oxylus, a descendant of the Aetolian race of kings. In obedience to the command of the oracle, Hippolytes was banished, an army and fleet once more equipped, and Oxylus elected commander-in-chief. And now success at length crowned the efforts of the long-suffering descendants of the great hero. They obtained possession of the Peloponnesus, which was divided among them by lot. Argos fell to Temenus, Lacedaemon to Aristodemus, and Messene to Cresphontes. In gratitude for the services of their able leader, Oxylus, the kingdom of Elis, was conferred upon him by the Heraclidae. And so we come to the end of tonight's reading. Sleep well, dream of old worlds. Until tomorrow night.